Our guest on This is America and the World is Dr. Marina Ottaway. Dr. Ottaway is a Middle East scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She formerly served as senior associate and head of the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Ottaway is the author of 9 books and has conducted research throughout Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. Dr. Ottaway, it's good to see you once again.
Great to see you.
I was thinking about the Arab Spring when you and I had a conversation a long time ago, and everybody's expectations were so high and the hopes were so high, and you said, not so fast, not so fast. Give us a little bit about the backstory of what triggered the Arab Spring, where we are today.
Well, what triggered the Arab Spring was a lot of generalized dissatisfaction with the employment situation, with the way people were treated, with the income and the income inequality in these countries and so on. But there was no organization behind the Arab Spring. It's one of those things where nobody really knows why it happened as it happened. For example, if the normal narrative is that this young man who immolated himself in Tunisia is what triggered. Nobody knows that in the previous weeks there had been 4 other cases of people burning themselves to death, and nothing happened. You know, and it was a series of events that led this time to resonate, and a lot of that had to do with the intervention of the labor unions, that in that region had both a great history of militancy, but also had dropped the ball badly in the case of a strike 2 years ago, and were determined to keep the process going this time. So it's very, nobody predicted the Arab Spring, and I do think that it was unpredictable. What was clear was that there was a lot of unrest and that people were unhappy. But people don't organize an uprising every time they are unhappy. And that second part of why at that point, why something that was almost routine, if I can put in terms of the level of unhappiness and so on, snowballed into an uprising. I don't have a rational explanation for that.
So when you look at Egypt, Syria, Libya, and what was the common denominators of these countries? You mentioned a kind of an unrest there.
And unease. These are countries. Egypt was, let me take Egypt first of all.
But authoritarian?
Authoritarian, they all have authoritarian regimes. But also there were authoritarian regimes that did not go anywhere. You know, China has an authoritarian regime, but China is going somewhere in terms of economic development, in terms of change. Egypt, for 30 years under Mubarak, simply did not go anywhere. Mubarak's main concern was not to rock the boat. So there was very little change and total stagnation. Libya was stagnating under Gaddafi. Potentially very rich country that were in fact, because it has a small population and it had a large oil production, and that oil, that revenue was not put to the service of developing the country. So I think it's the combination of authoritarianism and stagnation that really.
Stagnation. So corruption.
Corruption is certainly part of the stagnation, but also I think I don't think, for example, that Mubarak was particularly corrupt, but he was so afraid that change might lead to complications that he never wanted to do anything.
Wealth controlled by a few, is that a common denominator?
Yeah, but probably no more so than in most other countries. Including our country. So that I don't think it was, perhaps some of the differences were becoming more visible, but I don't think that's necessarily the only, I think it was accumulation of different things that came together little by little.
If you have authoritarian governments, you also have repression, huh?
If you have authoritarian government, you don't. Authoritarian governments
human
don't
rights.
give themselves a safety valve because they respond to any unrest with more repression, and so that builds up. And I think that's what's happening in some of these countries right now. Egypt is in for more trouble. And I cannot tell you where it's going to be next year, or it's going to be 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, because I think we are not good at predicting, because it takes something to trigger it. Mm-hmm. But Egypt is, the government feels insecure right now, and therefore it responds to any sign of unrest with a lot of repression. Mm-hmm. There is there is no space for anybody, even innocent complaints.
Let's take a little break right now and say to the folks at home, we're talking with Dr. Marina Ottaway. Dr. Ottaway is now senior scholar at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Expert unsurpassed about the Middle East and about some of the countries that we'll be talking about. So sit tight. Back on the other side, This is America and the World. This is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. Tourism, Malaysia. The Petroleum Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services. So, Doctor, look at Egypt, Syria, Libya, Tunisia. Where are we today with that uprising that happened in those countries? There were 7 or 8 different countries at that time of the Arab Spring. Where do we stand today with them? You paint a grim picture as far as Egypt is concerned. Might happen next week, might happen a year or 2 years from now.
Right. Well, let me start with the positive cases. Mm-hmm. And one is Tunisia. Tunisia, it's hardly a democratic paradise. The economy is still struggling, but there is a willingness to compromise between the major political parties. Mm-hmm. And I think they are, I'm relatively optimistic. I think they are going to make it. I think the country is going to stabilize. And if the country stabilizes politically, the economy is also going to start growing again. Also, Tunisia, it's a country that it's a very small country, mm-hmm. and it's relatively easy for the international community to help. It does not take billions and billions and billions to help the economy revive. So I'm relatively optimistic about that. The other country about which I'm relatively optimistic that nobody ever hears about is Morocco.
Yes.
Morocco had the very beginning of another spring. And the king was smart enough, now whether it's the king or it's his advisor, but somebody in the palace was smart enough to respond not with the repression, but with the reforms. Mm-hmm. And they enacted the new constitution. Now, the reforms now are moving at a glacial pace. He's in no hurry, mm-hmm. but there is enough sense of movement for the country to be quiet. Uh-huh. And some change is taking place. So compared to what is happening in many of the other countries of the region is, Morocco is relatively well off.
I had written down Morocco, but I had also written down Jordan as well, that they kind of saw what was coming and what was out there and started to make little changes to accommodate the people.
The problem with Jordan is that it is in the worst possible location.
Yes.
Because Morocco is off in a corner. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, it's a good luck of Morocco, essentially. They are not in the midst of all the crises. In fact, I think sometimes Morocco would like to divorce the Arab world and to become part of Europe. But, it's up there, right, next to Spain and so on and so forth. And it's really not directly involved in it does, for example, Tunisia, in addition, it's doing fairly well, but it's right next door to Libya, where you now have a major presence of ISIS.
Yes.
And there are cross-border incursions. Well, Morocco is, I'm not saying that it cannot happen, because you never say that, but essentially Morocco is a bit far more removed from the scene of all the trouble. So that is, in that sense, they are much better off than Jordan, that it is very affected by the refugee coming from Syria and Iraq. It's right, has common borders with the most troubled areas of the Middle East. So it also gets a lot of international support.
Let's focus on Syria.
Yes.
Because that is at least our day-to-day focal point of what's going on. Donald Trump says in his idea to ban Muslims, he said, we're going to ban Muslims till we find out what's going on. What's going on? I mean,
I think it's quite clear.
It's pretty clear. It's out there.
Clear what's going on. I mean, there are three different things going on, I would say, at the same time. One is there is definite opposition to the government of Bashar Assad. That is, certainly for a large part of the population, there is a lot of opposition. There is, of course, support for him, because there are people who still think that he can maintain, to the extent that there is ever going to be some stability in that country, it's going to come through an authoritarian government like the one his father had in place and he had in place. So, but you have very definitely this opposition. Then you have you have an armed opposition which is against him, what I would call the soft Islamists, if I can call them. They are not ISIS. They are not Al Qaeda. And those are the groups that the United States tries to support to fight against Assad. And then there is the opposition from ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And ISIS is a very nasty movement, essentially, that occupies territory, has created a proto-state. It's not a real state, but it does occupy territory, it governs territory, and it tries to expand that territory so that there is a war going on against ISIS. There is an additional complication with Al-Qaeda and the relationship between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Perhaps we won't go that way because we get lost in the weeds if we do that. But the United States finds itself in a terribly difficult situation in Syria, because it's totally against ISIS, of course, and it has no choice but being totally against ISIS. It's also against Assad, but at the same time, it does not trust these more soft Islamic movements that are fighting against ISIS. So in the end, the main ally of the United States on the ground in Syria are the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, and that makes Turkey extremely unhappy. So it's a no-win situation. And I doubt that, you started with Donald Trump. There is nobody who needs to be bent to have this information. I doubt that he understands any of it. But the problem is really not having the information. The problem is how do you solve this puzzle, essentially?
Is it our puzzle to solve?
We are involved. I don't think we can totally pull out. Should it be our puzzle to solve? Ideally not. But unfortunately, since the end of World War II, the United States has put itself in a situation, has announced to the world that all puzzles belong to it to solve. That every puzzle is an American puzzle to solve. And that's how we ended up by going in Iraq, and now we are in Iraq and we are in Syria, and it's certainly President Obama tried to step back from both conflicts and not get as deeply involved as his predecessor had. But it's still extremely difficult at this point to pull out completely. And most people don't understand, even in this country, they take this attempt to step back and to say, I think correctly, this really should not be our puzzle to solve. This is not, the United States cannot solve all the problems of the world. And there are problems that essentially we should not even try to solve, but that it's taken by a lot of people as a declaration of weakness.
Talk about President Obama for a second. You know, we were so war weary from Afghanistan and from Iraq. And his policy was to disengage, and that we couldn't solve all of the problems that sprung up there. How do you think he's done? And I ask that when I think of how many deaths do we have in Syria now? About 250,000 or so? 250,000?
Yeah, it's a very large number and millions of refugees.
Displacement and so on and so forth. I'm wondering if I remember a conversation I had with Madeleine Albright, and I asked her, were there any mistakes in the Clinton administration? And she said, Rwanda. We didn't act in Rwanda. Do you think that Obama's handled this correctly? Should we have done more? With your background and your expertise and experience, how do you think he's done?
There was no quick fix. I mean, should we have done more? Should we have tried to save these 200,000 plus Iraqis who died? It would have meant going to full-scale war. You know, don't forget that in Iraq, at the height of the surge in 2007, 2008, the United States had 140,000 soldiers there. There were many American deaths, and so on and so forth. And even with that presence, we left behind a huge mess. I mean, so that it's easy to say we should have done more, but what the more should have done, nobody really says. Because nobody is saying, even the most ardent interventionists are saying the United States should have put in tens of thousands of troops. I have not heard that argument made. So it's easy to say it should have done more, but it's not clear to me what Obama could have done that would have really had an impact on the situation without involving the United States again in a full-scale war or with an uncertain outcome.
What do you see as the future in Iraq? Do you think it will split up into three different kind of semi-countries or countries themselves, you know, with the Sunnis, Shia, and the Kurds?
I think it will split up. I don't think it will split up neatly into a Kurdish area, a Sunni area, and a Shia area. I think I think it's a question of time before Kurdistan breaks away from the rest of Iraq.
Will they do that on their own, do you think?
You mean without
the Kurds? They'll carve out their own independence?
They already have an autonomous region.
Yes.
That is getting no support from no financial support from Baghdad. They have a deal with Turkey where they can export their oil and gas through Turkey. Unfortunately for them, oil prices are what they are right now. They are rock bottom, so that makes it very difficult for Kurdistan. They have their armed forces, the Peshmerga, that are one of the main allies of the United States against ISIS in Iraq. So I think it's a question of time. I think what's keeping them from really breaking out is the fact that if they declare independence, then they have to face the problem of international recognition.
Yes.
And many countries that are willing to help Kurdistan as is, to accept Kurdistan as is, and so on, including the United States, would not recognize it as a country. The United States would be extremely reluctant to recognize the independence of Kurdistan. So I think they keep on pushing that issue on the back burner of full independence and sort of focusing right now on this autonomy, which is very close to being independence, but without the added complication of getting international recognition. But I don't think we are going to have a unified Sunni area, or we are going to have a unified Shia area. Those areas are very different from each other. Even now...
Is it a political war between the two sects? Is it social? Is it religious? How do you see Sunni and Shia?
In the end, it's always politics. It's
Politics.
power. It's power.
Power.
Yeah, it's power. Well, politics is all about power. I mean, the Sunnis always saw themselves as the most important group there. Sunnis even today don't believe they don't believe the statistical evidence that they are a minority in the country. That the largest group is by far the Shias, and that became quite clear when the United States insisted on having elections. The election turn is always turned in situations of that sort. It happened in Yugoslavia into an ethnic census, in a sense, because people, or sectarian census, people vote their identity. They don't vote for a program of a political party. They vote for a party that they think represent what they are: a Sunni party, a Shia party, a Kurdish party, and so on. And as a result of those elections, Shia parties have been in power ever since.
Iran, great influence in both Iraq now and in Syria, huh?
Yes.
What do you think? What do you see?
Well, the Iraq, okay, there are two different, I think the two countries are, the reasons why Iran is so interested in the two countries are somewhat different. Because in Syria, they really want to keep in power Bashar Assad. Because Bashar Assad is their, it's the way through, I mean, his regime is the conduit for aid to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But Hezbollah is no longer a Lebanese organization. Essentially, it's an Iranian militia to all practical purposes that does, what it's fighting in Syria because the Iranians want them to fight in Syria. It's training people in other parts of the world, and so on and so forth. So for Syria is very important because of Hezbollah and that entire connection. Iraq is important because to some extent because they want to have influence, but also because they don't want to have ISIS on their doorstep. The border, from the border of Kurdistan, which is where ISIS stopped up there, to the border of Iran on the other side of Kurdistan. I mean, Kurdistan is in the northeast of Iraq, right? And if you take the border between Iraq proper and Kurdistan on one side, and the border of Iran on the other, I don't think we are talking about 50, 60 miles. It's very close. It's very real, the presence of ISIS. And that does create an added incentive for the Iranians to be involved there. And they are very involved in the fight against ISIS.
Now, what do I do when we're at the end of our time, except to invite you to come back and continue our conversation? Because there are so many different things on the table to talk about.
There are certainly a lot of things to talk about.
So do you have one thought that you want us to carry with us as we look at the newscasts or look at the paper or go on the internet about this area of the world? What would you have us take with us from this conversation?
Probably that it's going to be a long time before it settles down. And that no matter what, well, Obama has done what he does, but what the next president will do, there are not going to be any quick fixes. even if the next president was to be much more interventionist than Obama is, these conflicts would go on for a very, very long time. And that is something that the US needs to really take into consideration. Whoever is going to make the next set of decisions needs to take into consideration, because intervening means getting the United States bogged down in yet another set of long wars.
Doctor, thank you so much for being with us.
You are most welcome.
It's a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
For information about This is America and the World, and to watch all of our programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, and look for us on Facebook and Twitter. This is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. Tourism Malaysia. The Petrolin Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.